Howdy, folks. How's everybody doing? I just wanted to, I don't know, go over something that's been on my mind for a little bit. I've been thinking a good bit about Vancian magic and the part that it plays in the design and the interactions of magic in Dungeons and Dragons. So, to give a little bit of like background, I guess I'm not the most familiar with the system. There are certainly experts out there who can talk to it a lot more succinctly and probably a lot more accurately than I can. But just to give you, what I know about it, Vancian magic has this idea that when you cast a spell, it kind of leaves your mind. Um, so the wizard is a great example of this, like the D&D 5e wizard. Um, this way that they have a spell book because they have to keep like relearning these spells. They have to have something for as a reference so that they can keep looking back and saying like, ah, yes, this is the spell. Um, and the whole idea of kind of spell slots, the way that Dungeons and Dragons does mana, is a very Vancian idea. And I'm not sure I'm the biggest fan of it. Um, for one, it's interesting. It's definitely interesting, but I almost feel like it's more of a peppering. Like it's something you'd want to throw in as like flavor in a particular kind of world, rather than how one should just assume magic works. Magic is already godlike in its power. Um, and to kind of almost shoehorn it into this system that is like, yeah, but there are these like predefined spells and you've got to use just those kinds of spells and all this stuff. It's a little bit odd in my opinion, and it's especially weird that like wizards have their spells that they have to like, you know, learn from a school or from their own personal study, copy into a spell book and do all this other stuff with, and sorcerers are just like, I know magic, bitch. Um, so that's always struck me as a little bit odd. And so why am I ranting about this? Not many good reasons. I am not about to fix the D&D 5e magic system, but I just want us all to kind of be, aware of some of the possible imperfections, and I might look at revamping the magic system eventually. Um, but that is not something I'm going to tackle right now because I am running a campaign with two different groups that take up quite a lot of my time. So I am busy laying out track for them. Uh, that gif of oh gosh, I can't remember if it's Tom and Jerry or if it's Looney Tunes now. I think it's Tom and Jerry. And Tom is, laying out the track in front of the toy train. We've all seen it. The DM trying to get notes together before the session, or playing everything by the seat, or flying by the seat of their pants and everything. Um, I'm doing enough of that. I don't need to jump on and also try and rewrite 5e's magic system in the meanwhile. But there's a few things that I think we can play with the magic system, and one of those things that I do in my home campaign is, since it's kind of a lower magic world, it's not necessarily low magic TM, but it is a kind of a world where magic is rarer, where folks who are just going about their lives in the day to day will not necessarily encounter magic very frequently, if at all. There are certainly people in my world who have never seen a spell cast. Never. They may never do so. There are people who live their entire lives without seeing it. And so it made sense in a world like that not every spell exists. The things you find in the PHB, they're not all there already. You know, if if Alina from Nowheresville, I love how I mixed the fantasy name with the weird random town name, but regardless, if your NPC from small town anywhere doesn't know about prestidigitation, how the hell is there a wish spell in that world, right? Or at least one that's accessible without nothing short of godlike effort. So there's a bunch of spells that just don't happen in my campaign world, and I have a list of them. For those of you watching on Instagram, Twitch folks can see this. Go watch on Twitch. Twitch folks, you guys can see all of this already. So I have lists for each spell level of a spell, its status, and any notes. So a spell can be, pardon me, allowed, limited, undiscovered, or in progress. Allowed is it works as it does in the PHB. Limited are for spells like banishment is a great example that I have pulled up. Some conjuration spells, some teleportation spells, because a lot of these spells deal with other planes or walking on the ethereal plane or pulling something from the elemental plane of fire or what have you. And these are not planes that are strongly connected to the material world in my campaign setting. So they're limited. They may not be able to pull as high CR monsters, or they may have a chance to fail. Um, Something like banishment, well, there is no home plane, so it kind of puts it into a pocket dimension for the time being instead of its home plane. Um, there are things like that. Oh, there are a few spells that are changed, like Guardian of Faith. I made 48. I don't think I've actually enforced that, um, but that's just because I don't like the way the spell works naturally. I think straight damage is boring. We like rolling dice. Um, but yeah, so you get allowed, changed, limited, in progress, and undiscovered. Oh, and impossible. Impossible will change throughout the course of the campaign. But for these spells that are limited, or sorry, not limited, in progress or undiscovered, there's the opportunity for the players to discover them, to assist the researcher or to conduct their own research independently to create that spell. Now, this happens regardless of whether you're a wizard or a druid or a sorcerer or what have you. Um, there is an undercurrent of raw power to magic, that it's this kind of untamed, chaotic force. And so it's not just that, like, oh, a wizard can sit down with a book and learn a new spell, while a sorcerer just, like, gets it from whatever source they have charismatically convinced to give them their powers. Um, they still have to kind of shape this raw power that they're given into the appropriate spells. They get access to more and more power as time goes on, but they don't just like get a spell. So let's go down and say like level 6. Let's find a spell that I kind of know more. Hero's Feast. Hero's Feast is undiscovered. Um, so like nobody's taken the time to make this spell. So a wizard could do it. A wizard could kind of research similar spells and tweak things, looking at spells like Good Berry and Create Food and Water and similar things like that, um, and try and basically just improve upon these. Use other materials, other incantations, other somatic elements to improve upon the way the spell works already, and then create something akin to Hero's Feast. In a similar vein, a warlock or a sorcerer might have this power kind of innately. They might discover that they're powerful enough to generate a spell like this, but they don't know quite how to shape it yet. So they have to research it. They have to trial and error, basically, just figure out how to cast this spell, the material, the somatic, and the verbal components. And just design wise, it gets more and more likely that something is not completely allowed or in progress as the spell levels get higher. Like 9 is a bunch of undiscovered, impossible, undiscovered, undiscovered, in progress, undiscovered, in progress. Like a bunch of those. And then there are certain spells like Resurrection that I made sort of quest spells in my world, but you don't have to kind of make it that that route, I suppose. You could definitely take a little bit more lean, more liberties with how you want to do it in your campaign. Um, or you could, make it so that not just resurrection spells, but resurrection spells and transportation spells are all kind of special, that they need some other quest in the world to fulfill and figure out. But let's dive into the meat of this. So, if you are a player in my campaign, or if you want to use this rule set, and you're like, well, okay, so how the heck do I make a new spell? I have set out some rules for this. So basically, the requirements, like what do you have to have in order to even try this? First of all, you have to be able to cast a spell of at least one level lower than the spell you're trying to create. So if I want to create Wish, I need to have at least an 8th level spell slot. I need to be able to cast 8th level spells in order to learn how to make Wish happen. Uh, One less because otherwise you'd get to the level of the spell and you'd be absolutely out of luck for any spells that were at that level, right? Like you can't have possibly researched the new shiny spell that you want before you level up. And that's kind of crappy. So I put it one lower to kind of mitigate that a little bit and make it so that you can start researching something even if you can't cast it yet, because that's cool. It feels more like discovery. Um, you also have to have money and time. So that's pretty basic, right? You need money and time for just about everything. Um, Time, you need the spell level over 2. So half rounded up. So if it's 5, it goes to 3 weeks. For a level 5 spell, you need that many weeks in order to create the spell. Now, unless you get a particular research drawback, which we'll talk about later, it doesn't matter how well you do on the rolls that we're going to talk about, you will always succeed in creating this spell. So I can roll natural ones every single week for my checks, and I will still make that spell. It just has a way better chance of having a flaw that I have to fix after the fact. But we'll get to that in a moment. So you get spell level over 2 weeks. uh, Question in chat: what the heck do you need time for? Material components. Come on. I'm sure there's at least one spell in the player's handbook that requires time, the spice, for its casting. And if not, you're free to make one with these rules. So have at it. Um, but yeah. So spell level over 2 weeks to create. Round up. You need 100 gold to start, and then every week it's 10 gold per spell level. So if you are making a 9th level spell, you need 90 gold per week, and you have 5 weeks of research time, so that is an extra 450 gold for a total of 550. Now, that's actually relatively cheap. Um, some of you will note that the materials for some spells are 1,000 gold or 5,000 gold. It's nowhere near this 450. This is a baseline. So if you want to say, oh well, this spell should definitely cost more than that, or this spell doesn't really have any serious material components, you can do it for way less. The GM is welcome to kind of adjust the levels of how much it costs to research the spell at their discretion. Um, but yeah, so that's the time and money you need. So how does this process actually work? Well, if you are a spellcasting class and you have that spell slot one level below what you need, or what the spell requires, sorry, and then every week you can make a check. Basically, it's assumed that in the downtime during the evenings, you can do this, or more likely, you're in a library or in some city that gives you access to a teacher or a master from whom you can kind of gain some insights as you're researching the arcane. So at the end of every week, you make a roll. Basic d20 roll, to which you add your spellcasting ability modifier. So not your whole spell attack mod. If it's If you're level 5 and you have +5 to wisdom and a +3 proficiency bonus, you don't add the +3, you just add the +5. So d20 plus your spellcasting ability modifier plus any proficiency in Arcana. Arcana specifically because this is research. You're not just, trying to attack something with your new spell. You're actually trying to figure out the process by which you pull magical energy from the surroundings and weave it into the spell that you want to cast. So Arcana is the more relevant skill here rather than just, cast a spell. So d20 plus your spellcasting ability modifier plus your proficiency bonus in Arcana. And you get a bonus if you have any spell slots that are above the level of the spell you're trying to craft. So if I have 5th level spell slots and I'm trying to craft a 3rd level spell, I get an extra +2 on that roll. And we'll go through a couple of examples here in a bit that will make all of this a little bit more straightforward. So, if you succeed on this roll, then a few things happen. Now, the DC for this roll is 15 plus the spell level. Straight and simple. If you succeed, then you remove a failure point, which we'll get to again a little bit later, but they're basically, when you fail, you get a failure point. You remove a failure point on a success, and nothing bad happens. You don't have any drawbacks. If you succeed by 5 or more, you get a boon on your research. So you roll once on a d4 table. The d4 is a 1. You have an efficient use of your materials, and the next week of research costs you no gold. On 2, I called this bug fix, but that's a little on the nose because I'm a programmer. It's, you found and ironed out an issue with your spell. You get to remove an extra failure point. So you succeeded, so you removed 1 failure point, and now because you succeeded by 5 or more and you got this roll, you get to remove another one. If you have none, so if you roll this and you have 0, you get to basically negate the next one you receive as you kind of preempt the issue and nip it in the bud. If you roll a 3, you make excellent progress, and you decrease the research time you need by a week. So your 5 weeks for a level 9 spell goes down to 4 weeks. Super nice. If you roll a 4, you make a very elegant discovery that eases your work. The next spellcasting check you make for progress on the spell has advantage. Spellcrafting check, sorry, not spellcasting. I should actually change that in the document. There we go. So, if you succeed by 5 or more, you get to roll on that table. However, if you fail this, so, make a shitty roll, my bonuses aren't enough, and my DC 15 cantrip, I fucked it up. Well, that's too bad. Then I add a failure point. Those are removed when you add a success, or, removed doubly when you get a 2? Yeah, a 2 on the research boons table. So there are ways to remove those. If you fail by 5 or more, however, you will roll on a similar table, but for drawbacks. If you roll a 1, you misfire during your research, and you basically just destroy the materials you were going to use. And you have to basically repurchase those materials in order to continue research. You cannot keep going until you get more. Effectively losing yourself a week unless you happen to be somewhere that you can immediately get access to those materials. If you roll a 2, you unwittingly introduce an issue. It's something insidious that kind of sneaks in while you're doing your research. You get an additional failure point in this case. If you roll a 3, your progress is slow, and you will require 1 extra week. So now your 5 weeks for a level 9 spell becomes 6 weeks. If you roll a 4, you hit a snag in your research that is it's a difficult problem, it's hard to work through, and the next time you make a spellcrafting check, I need to fix that in that place too. Spellcrafting check. will be made at disadvantage. Um, so effectively, yeah, these are like one for one. They balance out. Um, I've used these for a couple of spells now in my campaign, and so far they seem to be going really well. People seem to enjoy the process of researching a new spell. It seems to invest them a little bit more in what spells they choose and how they go about, choosing them and finding them, and um, it has even affected a little bit of like character choices, which I find really awesome. Like effectively, if your homebrew rules are making people's character choices more interesting, then it's probably a good homebrew rule. Um, so, an important thing to note about these rules: failure points do not mean that you don't complete the spell. Um, and this is like, big, bold, italic, underlined, horrible design, just grab your attention no matter how ugly it looks. Note: it doesn't stop you from completing the spell. I can be researching a level 4 spell 2 weeks, and I can get a natural 1 both times, and I will still complete my research on that spell. It will still exist. However, when the spell is complete, so you get, if it is a level 4 spell and it's 2 weeks of research time, you get your first spellcrafting check, your second spellcrafting check, and then it's done. And at the end, when it's complete, you make another spellcrafting check. It's the same DC and the same ability modifier. It's basically an extra week check, but it's not made after a week. It's made immediately. Again, you add your proficiency in Arcana, any bonuses for extra spell levels, etc. Um, and you subtract any failure points that are still left over from your research. So if I rolled my natural ones and I failed on both of my checks by 5 or more, and let's say both times I introduced that insidious issue, and so now I have. I don't know why it's doing that. My headset is just like cutting out every several minutes, regardless of how much I'm using it. It's very odd. Anyway, so let's say I have 4 failure points. So I make my check, I add my spellcasting ability modifier, I add my extra spell levels, and I'm proficient in Arcana, so I add all these bonuses, but then I subtract 4 because I have 4 remaining failure points. This is the one that matters. If you succeed, uh, nothing's wrong. The spell is cast exactly as it is in the PHB. You're good. Um, everything is hunky dory. If you fail, the spell is still complete, but it gains a flaw. Now, flaws are exactly what they sound like. They're issues with casting the spell, and they can range from, it's just a weaker version of itself to sometimes it backfires and hurts you. There's a table for this as well. It's the spell flaws table, and we'll go over that in a second. But effectively, once you introduce a flaw, you can still fix it. Um, all hope is not lost kind of thing. You can still continue to work on the spell effectively, but your checks are made daily instead of weekly. It's the same DC and it's the same bonuses, but you're making them every day. It's effectively like, the hour or 2 hours before you take your long rest, you are slinging the spell trying to figure it out. However, now you need to have a slot of the spell's level. Can't be one below. If you're trying to cast Wish or if you're trying to make Wish and you screw it up, you have to have a 9th level spell before you can fix your screw up. So let's say it was Wish. Let's say I was trying to make Wish. I was trying to bring that about in the world, and I failed my my checks, and I failed my final spellcrafting check. So it exists, but it has a flaw. I roll my d8, which is the die for the table, and it comes up with backlash. So I have to make a con save, DC 19, 10 plus the spell level, which is 9. And if I fail, I take 9 damage. If I succeed, I take no damage, and the spell is cast either way. So 9 damage for a 9th level spell, not that much of a drawback. I'm pretty okay with that. They're not meant to be necessarily game-breaking, and some are worse than others. But, I have this flaw, and now every day I'm trying to cast Wish, and if I'm smart, I'm probably wishing for things like very specific, like I wish for a single grain of, regular rice to appear in my hand. Boop. Something that can't go wrong. But side effects of spells aside, I'm casting the spell every day to try and expunge the flaw. And every time I do so, I'm making that same roll. And if I succeed, I mark down a success. 3 successes, and it's done. The spell is complete, the flaw is purged, everything is good. There's no real penalty for failing. This is mostly just a game of time. How long do you have to season your stew, to continue with the joke from earlier, but really, how long do you have to take in order to fix the spell? So if you fail, the DC for future checks goes down by 1, because effectively you're still figuring something out about why you're failing, even if you're not fixing it. The DC can't go below 1, of course. And the DC does not reset after you succeed. So if I'm doing my level 9 spell and my DC is 24, and I fail 6 times, getting it down to a DC 18, and then I succeed on 1, the DC for the next check is still 18. It doesn't go back up to 24 or up to 19 or anything like that. It stays the same. It can only decrease, not increase. Once you have, as I mentioned, 3 flaw save successes, the spell is purged, and your spell works as you want it to. Excellent. So that's super good, and that's what we want. So effectively, you can craft a spell and get it right the first time, or you can craft a spell and fail and have to, kind of fix it up as time goes on and kind of make up for lost time, make up for lost progress in fixing your flaws. So, that table. The spell flaws is a d8, and on a 1, you get the unruly effect. You do not add a proficiency bonus to spell attacks or save DCs for the spell. So again, these don't affect everything. If it's just something like, a thing appears, then this doesn't do anything bad, and you're basically fine. So good for you. You've avoided a flaw. But for things like, attacks or area of effects or anything like mind control-y, where the target has to make a save DC or have to make a save, your DC does not benefit from your proficiency bonus, and your attack roll doesn't benefit from it. So it's a little bit of a negative while you're still working out the kinks. If you roll a 2, the spell is unreliable, and it has a 10% chance to fail. So if you roll a d10 and you get a 10, the spell fizzles and nothing happens. You still expend your spell slot. If you roll a 3, the spell is overly complex. It's not as simple as it could be, and it requires a spell slot 1 higher level than its own spell level. Now, it doesn't change the level that the spell is cast at. If I have a 4th level spell and I cast it, it's cast at 4th level, but I expend a 5th level spell slot. If I don't have a 5th level spell slot, well, I can't be casting it to expunge the flaw anyway, so you'll have to wait to fix it. If the spell is 9th level, it fails automatically unless you happen to know Wish and are casting the spell using Wish instead. Now, I just kind of noticed an edge case in my mind while thinking of this. It's not written down. But for the 9th level spells, they automatically fail, but it doesn't, that doesn't break the ability to fix the flaw. If I have Wish and let's choose another 9th level spell. Keep going for wish. That's boring. Time stop. That's a fun one. Or true resurrection. Yeah, let's say I'm going with time stop. And it's overly complex. So technically I'd need a 10th level spell to complete it. That does not matter for fixing the flaw. The spell automatically fails. I try and cast it, and it fails. But as I'm trying to cast it during my 2 hours of downtime in the evening or whatever, I'm still learning more about what introduced that flaw, what problem there is with the spell. So I'm able to fix it over time. If you roll a 4, then the spell is weak. Any dice rolled for the spell's effect are decreased by 1. Not the results of the roll, but the die itself. So a d12 becomes a d10, becomes a d8, becomes a d6, etc. I like how I just went smaller for each one. That's fun, right? So, yeah, you decrease the level of the die. If the spell has an area effect, so if you're casting like Fireball and it has, I think, a 20-foot radius, that is decreased by effectively 1 level, which is kind of up to the DM's discretion as to what a level is. Maybe 20 feet goes to 10 feet, it's halved or something like that. Not halved in area, but halved in radius. Yeah, you get the point. It is the GM's discretion whether or not other aspects of the spell change as well. To try and bring up an example, let me see here. Let's go to D&D Beyond and look up their spells. Game rules, spells. I don't know. Let's pick on Cleric. And let's pick a 7th level Cleric spell. Etherealness. Sure. So if we have our weak effect on this, and we're casting the spell Etherealness, which has nothing to do with damage or areas of effect or anything, maybe it's the duration. The typical duration is 8 hours. Maybe that's, decreased to 1 hour or something like that. Or maybe if, you're on the ethereal plane during the spell, maybe there's a chance that something could affect you from the material plane during that time. So maybe instead of just being effectively completely invulnerable while you've cast this spell, maybe there's like a 10% chance that a spell would come through. GM's discretion. Your mileage may vary for this one. If you roll a 5 on the flaws table, your spell has a chance to backlash. When you cast it, you make a Constitution saving throw. The DC is 10 plus the spell level, not 15 like most of the other DCs in this rule set. If you fail, you take damage equal to the spell's level. If you succeed, you don't take damage equal to the spell's level. Super easy for you, This is not a huge setback. A level 9 spell only deals 9 damage to you if you fail this con save. Oh no. So not the biggest deal. 6, crude. The spell is ill-refined and casting it is difficult. When you cast it, make an ability check with your spell attack modifier. So if you're a cleric, wisdom. If you're a sorcerer or warlock, charisma, etc. The DC is 15 plus the spell level. On a failure, the spell is simply not cast. Your spell slot is unused, but the spell still takes its normal casting time. So if you're in combat and you try and cast a one-action spell, and it's crude and you fail your check, unfortunately you've wasted your action, but at least you didn't lose your spell slot. If you roll a 7 on the flaws table, the casting is slow. It's like moving your hands through molasses as you're trying to get the somatic components out. And the spell takes longer to cast than usual. If it would normally take a bonus action, it takes an action. If it would take an action, it takes 2 actions. Now this is a little bit weird. This is not something that has a lot of precedent in the rules as written kind of core rules for D&D 5e. 2 actions is, as far as I know, not a thing. But effectively, you are committing to using your action for that in the next round. So I cast my one action spell, and I'm committed to next turn my action is still casting that spell. I have left this kind of up to the discretion of the GM implicitly, but you could say yes or no to uh, do you have to concentrate while you're waiting between the actions? Angel Hardware, yes, this is indeed a White Claw. There are no laws on this stream, none whatsoever. But yeah, so one action becomes two actions. A minute becomes 10 minutes. 10 minutes becomes an hour becomes 2 hours. 8 hours becomes 24 hours. 24 hours is unchanged. That is kind of the limit. If you roll an 8, then your spell is feeble. The spell does not have kind of the expected concentration of power. And if you make a spell attack with it, then your spell attack is at disadvantage. And if your target would make a save, then that save is made with advantage. That mostly wraps it up. There's just kind of one extra kind of optional rule here. If you happen to be using Matt Colville's Strongholds and Followers rules, I have a little bit of a tie-in with that for these. If you have a stronghold or you have somebody else whose stronghold is like a research tower for a wizard or something and they're willing to assist in your research, then you can get a couple of benefits. First and foremost, the time taken for your research is reduced to spell level over 3 instead of spell level over 2. Still rounded up. However, Research Tower can create a cantrip in 1 day. You don't need a whole week for a cantrip, even though rounded up from 0 would take you to 1. If you have a Research Tower, 1 day. Super nice. For all of your cantrippy needs. Oh, this actually, reading this sentence in my notes made me remember something that I forgot to mention. You can actually work on multiple spells at once. If you are a wizard or a druid or what have you, just a normal spellcaster doing your own thing in your downtime, you can work on a number of spells equal to your intelligence modifier. So wizards get a little bit of an edge here, but I think that's appropriate, as a wizard is more familiar with the process of researching the arcane. And, a druid might have a little bit more trouble with it, so that makes sense, I think. You can't get below one spell. If your int is 8, then it's fine. You can still research a spell. That kind of accounts for the sorcerer's innate ability to just magic out of nowhere instead of magicking through study. But if you have a stronghold, that is not the limit. You can research more than your intelligence modifier. In fact, you can research as many spells at once as funds and staffing allow. This again is a little bit fluid. Kind of up to your GM how exactly they want to implement this, but if I had a level 1 oh no, my live video was paused. There we go. Okay. If you had a level 1 stronghold, a research tower, and you were, a druid or some not intelligence-based thing, then perhaps if you had maybe 10 or 20 people in your stronghold kind of willing to work for you at one time, I might add like 1 or 2 to your number of spells you could research at once. Also, funding is a limit. If you don't have the gold to pay the 100 gold plus 10 gold per spell level per week, then you can't research more spells. But strongholds are, powerful. They're useful resources. So, it's a pretty kind of loose limitation. If your stronghold is really good and you have a lot of people, a lot of followers, then, sky's the limit. Research 12 spells at once for all I care. If your GM allows it, go for it. Whether or not you are participating in this research, if you're in your stronghold or you're out on an adventure, the spellcrafting check still uses your spellcasting modifier, your proficiency in Arcana, and any bonuses that you would gain from higher level spell slots. This is just for uniformity and because you're basically directing the research. Even if you're not there, you've left instruction with your assistants to say, this is what you need to be doing day by day, and they can't do better than you. So it's effectively limited by you. When you make the final spellcrafting check, so again, let's go back to Wish. I've done my 5 weeks. I have some number of failure points, maybe. I have my bonuses, and I roll. Let's say I have 3 failure points left. The stronghold allows me to purge one of those failure points. So instead of having 3, I now only count 2 as a detriment to my roll. So I roll my d20, I add all my bonuses, and I subtract 2 instead of 3. This is another benefit that strongholds grant you. And if you are in a stronghold or having your stronghold research a spell, then if you are trying to fix a flaw, then your spellcrafting check has advantage. While you were in the stronghold, because you have to be the one casting the spell to fix the flaw, you have advantage on those checks. So that's super nice. All right, so let's jump into a pair of examples. And these will kind of just, I'm going to read them verbatim from my notes because I worded them very carefully. And these should kind of tie everything together. All of the, ability modifiers, all of the weirdness with the weeks, the fact that you can fail and still succeed, because your failure points are not against the actual progress on the spell, but against its end result. How to fix flaws, etc. So, let's say that the level 10 sorceress, Alisanne, uses Charisma as her spellcasting modifier, and she's proficient in Arcana. She has a +4 bonus to Charisma, and she has spell slots up to 5th level. Alisanne starts researching the 4th level spell, Faithful Hound, to get herself one good boy. She will research for 2 weeks in order to complete this spell. At the end of each week, she makes a DC 19, that's 15 plus the spell level of 4, skill check, adding her +4 from Charisma, +4 from her proficiency for Arcana, and another +1 for having a 5th level spell slot for a total bonus of +9. Let's say on week 1, she rolls a natural 3 for a total of 12. Not great. She fails the check by 5 or more, and she accumulates 1 failure point and rolls on the research drawbacks table. She rolls an insidious issue, and so now she has 2 failure points instead of 1. On week 2, she rolls a natural 13 for a total of 22. She expunges that 1 failure point that she just gained, and is ready to complete the spell. She makes her final check, rolling a natural 19 for a total of 28. She subtracts her 1 remaining failure point. Huzzah! The spell is created, and it works as intended. Since she passed her final spellcrafting check, there is no flaw introduced. Now, since Alisanne's intelligence modifier is +2, she has also been working on the 5th level spell Teleportation Circle. For this spell, it takes 3 weeks of research, and she does not gain an extra bonus for any higher level spell slots, making her bonus only +8. She makes her check for the spell of DC 20 with her +8 bonus. She makes her checks each week, luckily passing each time. But, on her final check, she rolls a natural 1. Her spell is created, but she has introduced an unlucky flaw. The spell is wont to backlash when being cast, and she has to make a DC 15 saving throw when casting it in order to not take the damage equal to the spell's level. Luckily, she has a 5th level spell slot already, and so she can immediately start work each day to expunge the flaw. After 5 days with 2 failures in the middle, Alisanne has fixed the backlash issue and can cast her spell Teleportation Circle normally. So, those examples I hope kind of give a little bit more cohesive view of what the spellcrafting rules are about. I really like this rule set. I find that it has, like I said earlier, kind of engaged my players a little bit more, made them think more about their choices as to what spells they want to take. This spell doesn't exist, but it's really useful. I should probably go and research it. Or, you know, I'm a cleric, and so I would normally get my whole spell list for free, but I don't get this one. Makes me feel bad, but also like it's not that useful of a spell. So do I really need to go and like figure it out? Probably not. So it introduces these extra kind of choices, these extra internal conflicts, and they've also come up with some really cool like character moments, like um, Kyanna in my remote group um, has been kind of struggling with this internal duality between the nature goddess that kind of quote unquote grants her her power, Auril, the goddess of seasons and harvests. Um, I don't quite want to call it a patron because it's not like a warlock type deal, but the magic that pervades nature largely comes from her, and that is where Kyanna draws her power from. So that's like her primary source, but then she's been dealing a lot with death in this campaign. There's been a lot of interaction with the Raven Queen, and there's been some interesting bits and pieces with Kyanna, like talking with the Raven Queen, wondering what the Raven Queen's motivations are, why she keeps talking in riddles, like all of this stuff. Um, and we had a character die a little while ago, and so she's been struggling with like that death and sort of coping with it and what it means. And they've also just in general noticed some hints that death in this world may not be as it seems. Uh, so Kyanna has been very interested in casting Reincarnate. Now she researched the spell, she got it to the point that she could cast it, but it has effectively a fatal flaw. It can't truly be cast because there's just sort of a disconnect from how one would naturally expect the spell to work, especially in like a fantasy D&D type setting, and how it will work given the idiosyncrasies of my campaign world. Um, Death is broken, for lack of a better word. There is no afterlife because of the planar rending that ripped the material plane from the other spheres of existence. Souls don't have an afterlife to go to; they just drift. But nobody really knows this. They still kind of believe that the gods are there, that there is some sort of afterlife. So, effectively, Kyanna had to go and die in order to discover this. She had to actually kill herself while attempting to cast the spell and reincarnating herself in order to go into this sort of limbo and discover what the afterlife is. See this just mindless sea of wandering lost souls and attempt to kind of reconnect with her own soul to bring herself back, and then take the knowledge that she gleaned from that visitation to the not quite afterlife and engineer it into how to make the spell work. So she succeeded, but it was a really, really cool like story and character moment to just see her go through the process of creating this spell. It was just really cool, really rewarding, and I think that by and large, this spellcrafting rule set is what brought that about. Um, so yeah, I mean, I gotta say, I recommend it. It was really fun. Uh, for those of you watching on Twitch, I have some tables up here that you can like pause and take a look at, or screenshot, or do whatever. But effectively, I calculated like average weeks that it takes to complete a spell. The red X's are where you can't have that bonus typically. Like you can't get a plus 19 on a spell level 2 without magic items because you're limited to plus 5 and plus 6 for your ability modifier and your proficiency bonus, and then you can't get plus 8 for extra spell levels because it's a level 2, so you can't have a level 10 spell slot. Uh, that kind of stuff. Not a big deal. For those of you watching on Instagram, don't need to worry about that. Um, Oh, and then I did a fun table that was average flaw purge time before the without accounting for the difficulty decreasing rule. So before uh, using a this is just weird math shit. So before I introduced the we need to decrease the DC, um, I did a little bit of math and did a Bernoulli distribution uh, on the spell levels that you could craft, uh, and noted the average or the expected number of days to purge and the variance in parentheses. And there is a not insignificant number of times when a spell could take 60 days to purge a failure or a flaw, and the variance being 1,140 days. And I don't think anyone wants to spend 3 years purging a flaw from a spell. I just don't think so. So, uh, that was like making that table. I went, oh fuck, and I made the DC decrease rule, which effectively limits it to at absolute most, I think 27 days. Oh yeah, I have it as a note here. 27 days. If you got straight natural ones for 27 days, uh, on days 25, 26, and 27, a 1 succeeds anyway. If you have no bonuses and you just keep rolling ones, you still can't take more than a month to purge a flaw with that DC decrease rule. So that came from a realization that it could take 3 years if I don't do this. So let's mitigate that and put in that rule so that it can't ever happen that you're purging a flaw for 3 years. But yeah, so that's kind of the ins and outs of my spellcrafting rule set. Um, I think it's super fun. I think it adds a lot to the game. Um, keep a watch. Well, not watching, but keep your ears tuned for upcoming videos. Um, I think I want to do one on a runic magic system, and I also want to do one on soul stones, which are an artifact. Which are an artifact that's kind of unique to my game world. Soulstone and runic magic kind of have their own. I don't want to say idiosyncrasies again because I used that word earlier, but I can't think of a better word. So yeah, they kind of have their own idiosyncrasies, and I want to do a little bit more of a deep dive on those. But keep an eye out for those guys upcoming. I think they'll be really fun, but I haven't fleshed them out yet, so I can't tell you for sure. But yeah, so thank you guys for tuning in to my little talk on spellcrafting rules. And yeah, may all your rolls be lucky.